You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
This morning we are going to return back to this series that is called Apocalypse Unveiled, which, if you remember, the word apocalypse means unveiling. So technically it's unveiling, or unveiling the unveiling, whatever. And this is a book that's been, we haven't looked at this series now for about over a month, because my wife and I and our family were gone for a few weeks. So we had Scott and Scott preach, and then we had Easter, so we took a break from that. But now here we are back on to this series, and this is part 9 in this series on this mysterious, cryptic book that over time has birthed just so many conspiracy theories, so many speculative conclusions on pretty big things like how the end of the world is going to come about, or things like what is God like, and for my money, I think that a book that is, so completely inundated with imagery and symbolism and references to a very specific first century culture or to the Old Testament allusions and pictures from the Old Testament, I think Revelation is a very tenuous foundation to draw some of these important conclusions from, especially conclusions about how we understand God. I think that's a pretty important question. And I think that with a book that is just so full of imagery and symbolism and stuff, to draw hard and fast conclusions on what God must be like based on this is a bit tricky. And so I don't recommend it. I think there are other books throughout the rest of the scriptures that help us do that, especially in the Gospels and especially throughout the epistles. But because so many people have done so, especially I would say in perhaps the last 100 years or so, there is an argument that can be made that the book of Revelation has done more harm than good in our world. Would you agree? And so in this series, we are trying to undo that. That's a tall order. But because Revelation is part of the biblical canon, and so for those who desire to be faithful to the person of Jesus and who at the same time hold Scripture in high regard, we are compelled to grapple with this text and to find faithful ways of reading the book of Revelation and to even to rescue it from some of its misguided applications, to redeem this book, as it were, in a way that is actually helpful and instructive for us as the 21st century audience reading this, recognizing this book wasn't written to us, but what does it have to say to us? What can it share? What wisdom is there in this book, that we can find relevance to here in 2026 in Thunder Bay, Ontario? And so our approach to accomplish this tall order has been to acknowledge that we hold certain presuppositions as we go into the study of Revelations. And this is true for anyone who's ever picked up the Bible. They hold certain presuppositions about what the Bible is about and what God is like, and that is particularly true about the book of Revelation. And it's really important for us to acknowledge those things. I think a lot of missteps in how we apply the scriptures comes from failing to recognize that those presuppositions, that we all carry presuppositions as we read the Bible. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge those, to ensure that we get them sorted, and to try to make sense of a book that is especially as arbitrary and as subjective as Revelation is. And so these presuppositions, that's a big word, these presuppositions serve as sort of guardrails to make sure that we don't fly off the cliff of how we understand God in particular, how we think about God. And years of irresponsible reading of Scripture, especially of Revelation, shows that it actually won't be fine if we don't acknowledge those presuppositions, those assumptions. And so here is the main presupposition that we hold as we read Revelation. And in fact, I think it's safe to say all of Scripture, and is this: that God is most perfectly captured in the Son. And the author Brad Jerzak says, the portrayal par excellence of God's very being is the cross of Christ. The cross is the perfect revelation of who the Father God is. This is the presupposition we hold. And I think the New Testament paints that portrayal very clearly, that if you want to know the Father, look to the Son. And especially at the cross. At the cross, we see specifically what cross-shaped or cruciform love looks like, right? In Jesus, and we've just looked at Jesus on the cross in the last week, we see here one who offers himself willingly, who would rather suffer violence than inflict violence. We see a love that bears shame, that absorbs hostility, that forgives even those who mock and who murder him. He offers forgiveness. And here we see a God who not only sympathizes with human pain and with our violence, but enters into that violence fully. He empathizes with us because he experiences it. And so the cross is not where an angry God is calmed down by, Jesus as he dies. This is not how we understand the cross. The cross is where the heart of God is unveiled. It's revealed as radically forgiving, as utterly self-giving, and as co-suffering love. And those are terms that we say over and over and over again to help drive that truth home. So that informs how we hold God, how we see God. That is the number one indicator of what God is like. And so in this fundamental view of God we proclaim here at Grassroots, and we keep that at the front of our minds as we read the book of Revelation. Well, what does that mean practically? It means, then, that when we come across texts within the book of Revelation that seem to betray this understanding of who God is revealed as at the cross, well, then we are obligated to reinterpret that text in light of the crucified Jesus. Are you following? So in light of all the violence and the blood spilling and the vengeance and like the meteors crashing to earth and all of that stuff, I'll be honest, the task has not been easy to insist that this is the God who's revealed in the text. But nothing worth fighting for is easy. And the truth is, and I hope this has been your experience as well, that as we've been going through this series, I have found this to be a very rewarding study. And it is illuminating all sorts of things about who God is. And it's teaching me all sorts of things about myself and my own complicity with empire and things that I need to get straight. And so I hope that has been true for you as well. Now, here's my project for this morning. And I get that some of us are really loving this series on the apocalypse, and some of us are kind of hoping that we'll move on now. I get that, but if you'll humor me, I'd like to spend spend a few weeks anyway on the last couple of chapters of Revelation 2021. Most importantly, because the book of Revelation ends on a very hopeful note. And anytime we come across hope in our Bibles, I think we should spend a bit of time. We should not kind of brush over that really quickly. I want to spend some time there, so I'd like to really focus on that, which means if we're going to get out of this book in the next year, we're going to have to kind of trudge through chapters 14 through 18. And so we're not going to look at every one of these chapters, but let me just summarize them really quickly. Chapter 14, the Lamb's people endure. So this is sort of in contrast to 13. We'll talk about chapter 14 a bit today. Babylon's fall is announced. Judgment imagery begins. Chapter 15, heaven worships and the 7 bowls are prepared. You can read all this on your own, by the way. Chapter 16, the bowls are poured out and the beast world starts to collapse. The beast, again, is empire. We'll talk about that. 17, Babylon, is exposed as a seductive, violent empire. Chapter 18, Babylon falls and those who profited from her mourn. So the yes, there's lots of really rich, good stuff in there that we could study. But these chapters are largely about God's wrath or his judgment being poured out. And to be honest, this is some of the most challenging stuff in Revelation, at least challenging from a standpoint of seeking to read it through the lens of the cross. However, my hope is that after this morning, we'll have the tools, so to speak, or the proper approach that can help make sense of some of these challenging passages. And so this morning, my task is I want to take one passage, possibly as I've read through all these chapters, I think this one might be the most challenging, the most difficult one, at least it is for me. And I want to try to read it in a way that is faithful to the Lamb on the throne, the cruciform Jesus, and faithful to the text. And then to encourage us then on our own to read these next few chapters in that sort of same vein. And then next week, because I prepare the sermons like the day before, I don't do a lot of prep in terms of like long distance planning, so you probably have picked up on that. But next week, my hope is that we will look again at just sort of one more example of sort of God's wrath poured out in these chapters, and that is the story of the mysterious rider on the white horse who comes and slaughters everyone with his sword. You guys remember that story? I think it was in chapter 19. Pretty graphic visual, and so I think next week we're going to take a look at that, and we're going to apply sort of the same lens that we're doing today to that, and it'll help reinforce some of this stuff. And then after that, we will, like I said, go into the hope of new creation, which is the end of chapter Revelation. So does that sound good for sort of the trajectory that I'm taking us on as we close off this series? But this morning, let's start by saying kind of where we left off. Again, this is about a month ago. So we read chapter 13, which follows chapter 12, as many of you are aware. And there in chapter 12, we saw a heavenly battle being waged between Michael and the Satan. And Satan loses, and he decides to then go after God's people. And that's how chapter 12 ends. Chapter 13, we see this loser Satan, this dragon. He calls on two beasts, one from the land, one from the sea. And here we are showed how the sea beast frightens the church into disobedience, while the land beast deceives people into false worship. And these two tactics, fear and disobedience, these have been tools that have been employed by the evil one, by Satan, since the beginning. And we are instructed on how to resist them. We are told through patient endurance, through faithful witness, and through wise allegiance to the Lamb, rather than submitting to the beastly logic of empire. So that is where we left off. Now, chapter 14, this is where we want to spend a little bit of time this morning. It opens with the redeemed, those who are with the redeemed. They're standing on Mount Zion with the Lamb, and they have escaped the beast. And they sing a song of celebration, which weirdly, and I don't know why, but only they are able to learn. And then 3 angels show up. And the first angel comes and he proclaims the eternal gospel, telling every nation and every tribe to give God glory because the hour of judgment has come. And so here's the beginning of all of the judgment that is to come on Babylon, on empire. And here's where I want to pick up this morning on verse 8 of chapter 14, if you want to follow along. I'm reading from the NIV. A second angel followed and said, Fallen is Babylon the Great, which makes all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. A third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast and its image and receives its mark on their forehead or on their hand, they too will drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, or for anyone who receives the mark of its name. Whew. Okay. So, at first glance, this is a challenging read, isn't it? And even at second glance, it's a challenging read. And a third, and a fourth. By all accounts, it would appear here that God's fury is being poured out as torture on those who are marked by the beast. I mean, pretty much says that. But like all of Revelation, I want us to keep a few very important things in mind as we read this. First of all, everything in Revelation, most everything, except for the first few chapters, is to be taken, what? Anyone? Figuratively. Man, my son, he's so dumb. Figuratively. Figuratively, symbolically. It is metaphor. So that's the first thing. And then on top of that, everything in Revelation is typically very hyperbolic. It's a huge exaggeration. And so it's not intended to be taken literally. That's the first lens, the first truth as we read this passage. So he's talking about Babylon the Great. Now, we know, we've said this throughout this series, that for John, the author of this book, he uses Babylon to refer to what? Rome. That was the context that he was speaking to, right? So Babylon is represented in Rome. And but more broadly, and again, we've been saying this, it refers to sort of any empire, any power structure system that follows in the way of Babylon. And that has been announced, that has been happening all throughout history, right? We are calling this the way of empire. And if you need a refresher on what exactly empire looks like, you can actually skip ahead to chapter 18, and John goes into detail about Babylon's great fall. Why does Babylon fall? Because of its insistence in carrying out its destructive ways that exploit and that dehumanize and that ignore the oppressed and that enslave and violate others and that are bent on living in luxury and indulging in sexual immorality and all of these just terrible, terrible things. You can summarize it this way. I think I pressed the wrong button, John. Can you help me? Okay, all of these ways of evil or empire can be summed up as this never-ending drive to put ourselves first and to rise above others. So we could say any way of living that exploits or that dominates or that controls others or that elevates the self, that seeks to get the biggest piece of the pie for me and mine, those are the ways of empire. That is the way of Babylon. This term Babylon becomes a catch-all phrase that captures a way of being in this world that fundamentally opposes, listen to this, fundamentally opposes the way of the Lamb. You have empire and you have Lamb, and they both offer a way of living. And in the Lamb, we see an others-oriented, sacrificial way of living that we are called to. And the slain lamb demonstrates that. First, he leads the charge in how to live that way. And then he bids all those who were to follow him to do the same. So it says, Babylon makes all nations drink the maddening wine of the wrath of her adulteries. And I have to be honest, I really love that poetic language. It's beautiful. Even though it's talking about something pretty grim, it's kind of cool. In other words, the logic of empire, and tell me if you don't think this is true, the logic of empire is so pervasive that it spreads throughout the whole world until it just becomes the water that we swim in. And we don't even see it. We don't even notice it. It just ends up making sense to us. So much so that when we see acts of kindness or selflessness, or we see compassion in our world, we stop and we take notice because it's so rare. That's not the way the world works. The world works through empire ways. And Lamb says, actually, when you do these things, you are resisting empire. And so we tell stories and we write movies and create movies, and we love to tell stories of the way of the Lamb because it's so rare and yet it's so compelling and beautiful. Amen? We do. We're all, I cry every time. We watch a show called Scrubs, which is mostly about hedonism and mostly about sex and getting together with partners, and it's just kind of super inappropriate and very, very, I would say, empire-like. But there's always this part. How many people have watched Scrubs? There's always this part at the end where JD does this like inner monologue thing where he reflects on like the compassion or the goodness of one of the doctors or some life lesson that a patient teaches them. And it's always selflessness. It's always thinking of others. It's always putting the needs of those around you ahead of your own. And of course it makes me cry. It makes me cry all the time. I watch these episodes over and over and over again. It's so predictable. But anything that kind of goes against the grain of empire, we could say that is what the way of the Lamb looks like. So those are the two ways of living. We've established that over and over again. Now, Israel in the Old Testament is called adulterous. And it's called adulterous because it is unfaithful to Yahweh. Right? They keep chasing after false gods in the Old Testament. Yahweh is considered their bridegroom. And so the nation of Israel, every time it turns its back on Yahweh, it chases some other false god. That is why we call it adultery. And so this is what's happening here. All of the nations of the world have turned away from the way of Jesus, and they are following the way of Babylon. They are drinking the maddening wine of chasing after false gods. And that intoxicating wine does just what it says. It's maddening. It makes them insane. So first off, before we go too much deeper, can you see yourself in this? Now, I know the text says that this judgment, this wrath is saved for those who have the mark of the beast. And as we discussed about a month ago, that meant the citizens of Rome under Nero, because Nero would have been the one, most scholars agree, he was the one who was the beast that had the number 666. And so all the citizens of Rome who follow after Nero, that's who is being spoken of. But surely, don't call me Shirley, surely we can find application in our own culture and even in our own lives. Because tell me, you haven't been enticed by the allure of wealth and luxury and pleasure, even if it may have meant someone else was dehumanized or exploited or victimized or taken advantage in order to bring you that wealth or luxury or pleasure. I won't ask you to look at the tag in your shirt to see where it was made, but most of us do not have to look very far to realize how often our comforts and our luxuries are entangled in someone else's suffering. Do they? And this is exactly what it looks like to wear the mark of the beast in our day, and thus to drink the intoxicating wine of Babylon's adulteries. But what does it do? It drives us mad. We become obsessed with that. It's a form of insanity, says John. The consequence of the intoxicating way of empire is to go mad. That's the fallout. Notice in this passage then that the intoxicating wine of Babylon's adultery is the same as that of God's fury. They're not two separate things. And if you look here, it says all the nations drink the maddening wine, and then in verse 10, it says the maddening wine it says, if anyone worships the beast, they too will drink the wine of God's fury. So John is equating these two things. The maddening wine of Babylon's adultery is God's wrath. Their own drinking of Babylon's infidelity causes them to become mad, to become insane, and this becomes God's judgment on them. The metaphor, maybe it's a little bit different, but it might be even a little bit too on the nose. You've heard of people who go out drinking, who get smashed and hammered, and they find themselves living with huge regret the next day, right? They have made decisions in their inebriated state that has far-reaching implications. They're maybe financially or relationally, they said something that was stupid that lost them their job, or they have relationships or whatever that are falling apart, whatever. And people do stupid stuff when they're drunk. And at the very least, you wake up with a splitting headache. Now, do we say, God, why did you do that to me? Some of us do. We shouldn't. We don't blame God for that. We say this is this is our own stupid decisions, right? This is entirely our own doing. And God's wrath is simply the consequence of you drinking like an idiot. But that was on you. And my own experience has shown me, not in that particular area, but in general with sin, that this is the nature of sin. It typically ends up punishing itself. Has that been your experience? You can say it this way: sin carries the seed of its own ruin. Or you can put it another way: sin will always turn in on itself. Or you can put it another way: destruction is built into the logic of sin. One more. Sin contains within itself the impulse toward collapse. That is the implicit nature of sin. It takes care of itself, right? And I think this is what the fury of God's wrath looks like. So there's not some external punishment being inflicted here, but it's simply what naturally happens when you go against the way of the Lamb. But it gets even more gruesome. The next part of this passage is often used as justification for eternal conscious torment, or hell. The idea of burning in hell forever and ever, which is a whole discussion I don't want to unwrap this morning. And we will one day discuss this. And so I'm not arguing one side or the other. I just want to ask this morning, is this passage actually speaking about eternal conscious torment? So let's read again from verse 10. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb. Wow, that sounds fun. And the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its images, or for anyone who receives the mark of its name. So again, make no mistake, this is a challenging passage. But again, if we approach this passage literally, as has been done way too often throughout history, then what it's saying is these people with the mark of the beast are being tortured in front of the Lamb, in front of the angels, and they're sitting there watching this happen forever. And again, literally reading this, it seems the point of the suffering isn't there to teach us anything. It's not there to refine us. It is there simply for the point of vengeance. God will have his vengeance. And again, forever. And so once again, we have to ask this question: is this the nature of God's wrath? Would the Jesus who died for his enemies be satisfied to watch them, to sit there and watch them burn forever? I just don't think so. I have a really hard time loving that God, I'll be honest. But that's okay, because I think this portrayal of a vengeance-seeking lamb goes so completely and utterly in the opposite direction of the central message of how Revelation portrays Jesus as the slain lamb. And it's certainly not the dominant picture of God that is revealed in Jesus of the cross, who is defined once more through others-oriented, self-sacrificial love. We have two very distinct pictures of who God is here. We are compelled to go and say, what else could this text mean? What do we make of this passage? Well, again, we keep in mind hyperbolic language. This idea of smoke ascending forever. This is a picture from the Old Testament. It comes from Isaiah 34. Isaiah is giving a judgment on the nation of Edom. This is what he says: Edom's streams will be turned into pitch, her dust into burning sulfur. Her land will become blazing pitch. It will not be quenched night or day. Its smoke will rise forever. From generation to generation, it will lie desolate. No one will ever pass through it again. Now, here's something fascinating. Edom is long gone, but it was located in the south of Jordan. And this is crazy, but if you visit it today, it's incredible. There is still this mysterious smoke that comes from the ground. No, that's not true at all. I was wondering if any of you were like, what? No. I was wondering if you were following. No! Whatever smoke was there has long fizzled out, and thousands of people walk through this area every day. So clearly it wasn't meant to be taken literally. And I don't think it's meant to be taken literally here in Isaiah or in Revelation either. Greg Boyd, a pastor and theologian down in Minnesota, that we often quote here, he thinks that the key to understanding this complicated passage is to keep in mind that the Lamb, Jesus, always represents truth, right? He always represents truth about who God is and truth about reality, all truth. And so we can say the Lamb represents all that is true. And in contrast, the beast represents all that is false. He represents deception. So all of those who follow the beast are those who have bought into the lies of the beast. They've exploited others, believing it will bring them comfort. They've neglected the welfare of their fellow humans, believing that they are not as valued, not as important, right? They indulge in materialism and consumption to the max, believing that if they just get a little bit more, it will make them happy. And all of it, though, are lies, 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 but it's a way of living. It's a deceptive way of living. And so how are they tortured? They are confronted with truth. They are brought into the presence of the Lamb who is truth, and that can be torturous. Listen to this. When truth exposes a lie, it is painful. It is very, very hard. I think one of the more clear examples of this in our day is when you think of those church leaders, pastors, politicians, people who are in authority, especially, let's say, pastors who are in authority over someone and they have influence, they have, a general sphere of influence, it's quite large, and then they are caught living a lie of whatever it might be. They may have been having an affair, or they were stealing from the offering plate. I don't know. There's all these stories that are coming out these days of church leaders who lived a lie, and then they are confronted with the truth, right? And what happens to them? It's a form of hell, right? Their lives unravel. They lose their family, their job, their churches fall apart. They have mental health breakdowns. They reach just rock bottom. And you hear these stories and you're like, yeah, well, they had it coming. And they did have it coming because that's the consequence of sin. It's baked into the sin, right? And so that, I think, is the symbolic fire that is happening here. The torture that is happening. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul is writing here, and he says that each person's work will be revealed to them by fire and tested. What is solid and true will remain, and what is shallow, what is false, it's going to be burned up. And this idea of a refining fire is a metaphor. It's used both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And God is often spoken of as this consuming fire, and it's this idea of refining, getting rid of all the impurities, the dross that makes us sinful. And it's in this case, it's the dross of self-centeredness and of pride and of greed and of domination and of deceit and violence and exploitation, and every false way of being human has to be burned off of us. Has to be put through the refining fire. And what remains is the self-giving, others-oriented way of the Lamb. All of us need to be refined. And this fire is painful, but its purpose is not cruelty. Its purpose is not vengeance. Its purpose is to purify. To strip away all that is false so that only what can live in the light of the Lamb can remain. Again, I think of those pastors whose sin has been laid bare, who have reached rock bottom. And some of them have received the grace of a refining fire and have been transformed, right? They have experienced that grace, they've reached rock bottom and they have been refined and they have been changed, and there is like a contriteness in them. There is a new way of seeing the world. There is sort of a new take on life that has a very different posture. But others, they resist that grace. They resist being refined by the hell of their own making, and they persist, and the smoke of the torment lasts forever. They dig their heels in, they become even more proud. They resist any challenge to what they are saying or doing. You've seen these people on TV, and you shake your head at them. And I think this is the nature of God's judgment. And it is entirely consistent with the character of the slain lamb. His wrath, his judgment, it's not some externally imposed torture or suffering for the sake of vengeance. Dealing with the consequence of sin may be a form of hell, but it's not a hell born out of vengeance. It's a fire that is meant to refine us. And so again, this passage here in Revelation 14, it's definitely one of the tougher sections to make sense of. But it serves as an example of how to read other passages of wrath or judgment that is being poured out. Wrath that is called God's wrath or the Lamb's wrath several times in Revelation. And so we can step back and we conclude that even if the judgment and that wrath is attributed to God or to the Lamb, it is that only insofar as it is God handing this rebellious world over to the natural consequences of its own actions. It reminds me of what C.S. Lewis wrote in his book on hell in The Great Divorce. My daughter and I read this a couple months ago. I don't know. Some of these books, I wonder. Anyway, this is what he wrote. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, "Thy will be done." And those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." Do you follow that? In other words, there will be those who pray for God's will to be done on earth, and there will be those who will persist in their own will to be done on earth. And in the end, God says to both, so be it. And those who persist on their own way, that way that goes against that others-oriented way of the Lamb, God says he allows them to have what they insist on, only to find that it is agony. It is hell to depart from the way of the Lamb. But if you want freedom from God, if you want freedom from the way of love, the way of sacrifice, the way of serving, all the ways that God's kingdom is built on, then God relents and God says, "Thy will be done. So be it. Go at her." He will not coerce us or force us. He invites us into his way. And he allows the impact and the full weight of evil, the natural consequences of sin that are built into it, to be felt, right? And so as we read these passages of suffering and wrath and all this terrible stuff that happens in Revelation, we need to read it not as God punishing those sinners, but instead as God allowing them to feel the full weight of the consequences of their chosen idolatry and their disordered desires. I think that's the takeaway here. And that is completely consistent with the slain Lamb revealed in Jesus.